Okay, so why don't we get started? Thank you once again to everyone who is joining us for this very important webinar. My name is Jesus Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the Central Valley Immigrant Integration Collaborative, or CVIIC. And as part of the work that we do as an organization is organize informational webinars that we think are of value and relevance to organizations that work with immigrant families. We work with a lot of organizations here in the Central Valley and also belong to networks at the regional and state level. And as part of one of those network meetings that we belong to with another network, I had the pleasure of connecting with Amanda, who gave some very valuable presentations in some of those meetings. And in the last meeting that we had, she presented on the Digital Equity Act that I knew a little bit about, but not really very much. And after her presentation, which I found very informative, I asked her if she would be willing to do a presentation that would also be aimed at the Central Valley organizations. Right away, she was very eager to do so. So I want to thank you, Amanda, for being so willing to participate. And also, she has invited and involved Karina Paredes-Arzola from also the National Skills Coalition to be part of this presentation. So I want to thank both of you, Karina and Amanda. I think the colleagues from the Central Valley and other parts of the state that are joining this webinar will get a lot out of it. And without further ado, why don't we go to the presentation, Amanda and Karina, and by all means, feel free to tell us a little bit about the National Skills Coalition. And to colleagues who are joining us on this webinar, there's going to be plenty of time also for question and answers. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself at the end of the presentation, or write in the chat box or in the Q&A button as well. So we have multiple ways in which you can participate and make a comment, ask a question. So welcome once again, Amanda and Karina. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jesus, for that introduction. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Again, we're covering the topic of new funding from the Digital Equity Act, what this means for immigrants and English learners specifically. Again, my name is Karina. I'm State Network Manager with the National Skills Coalition. I'll be talking a little bit about our organization and also getting into the nitty-gritty about the Digital Equity Act. You'll be hearing from my colleague Amanda, who's a senior fellow with NSC. All right, so here we are coming here together because we are in a moment of exciting opportunity of federal funding coming into California. And as we mentioned, so there's federal legislation that's going to invest millions to California, specifically for digital inclusion. And so this is an important time for immigrant advocates specifically to start thinking now on how they can ensure that these investments reach all of the communities across California, including the Central Valley. And I know we have a lot of folks from the Central Valley today and also from other parts of California. I saw someone from Orange County, so shout out to Southern California as well. And a little bit about today's conversation and what we're going to cover. So I'll be talking about who is NSC, National Skills Coalition. We'll be going into what the Digital Equity Act is, what this means for the Central Valley and rural communities specifically, and we want to sort of hear from you about the implications and what you're all thinking about. I'm glad that you'll have the opportunity to maybe unmute yourselves at the end of the presentation, like Jesus mentioned, and also where would you like to go next? All right, so about the National Skills Coalition, I know many of you may not have heard about NSC, maybe some of you have, but what I wanted to highlight is one of the main things about our vision. And so at NSC, we believe that jobs that require skills training, which make up the majority of jobs in the United States, are the backbone of our economy. And NSC fights for a national commitment to inclusive, and I want to highlight the word inclusive because sometimes a lot of these opportunities are offered to everyone. So inclusive, high quality skills training so that more people have access to a better life and that more local businesses see sustained growth. So our impact, we have been around for more than 20 years. Prior to starting the recording, Jesus was mentioning that he went to an NSC training back in 2010 or 2011. And so for 20 years, through an expert analysis and technical assistance, along with broad-based organizing, which I'll talk a little bit more about, targeted advocacy, cutting-edge communications, NSC has changed hundreds of both state and federal skills policies that have gone on to impact thousands of lives and grown local businesses and economies. One thing that I really want to highlight is that NSC does not accept public funds. So just so you know, we won't be competing for Digital Equity Act funds. All right, so another thing that I feel really sets NSC apart as a policy organization is our work around our networks. And so obviously we have our national network of national organizations, experts, and our work on federal policy. I myself, as a state network manager, work more with the state networks. And so we call them our SkillSpan networks, which stands for State Policy Advocacy Networks. We have coalitions across 20 states nationwide. On the West Coast, we're working in California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. And then we have our Business Leaders United network branch and working with various state coalitions with small to mid-sized businesses as well. And just like I mentioned, our state coalitions, I wanted to highlight our work in California through our Skills for California network. And our guiding principles for that is equity, pathways to good jobs, and systems innovation. And so for the Skills for CA network, we do have our yearly policy priorities, which I have linked to here in the PowerPoint, which you will get after this presentation. I encourage you to take a look at it. Policy priorities ranging from removing barriers to Cal Grant and financial aid to increasing childcare. And we also have yearly budget asks that we put out. Also, we had our annual Skills for CA Summit about a month ago, and the recordings are now available on the website. I'll go ahead and put them into the chat box shortly, but just wanted to highlight that for you all, that you can go ahead and watch it. Our summit is a 3-day event where we have 2 days of panels, and then the third day folks have the opportunity to go do legislative visits in Sacramento, or this year we had them all virtual. And this year we had panels around job quality and worker voice, one specifically on immigrant and refugee communities, opportunity youth, and inclusive career pathways. And if you want to know more about our work in California, I encourage you to all sign up for our mailing list and join the Skills for CA network. And as always, we want to hear from you all. So would love to talk to some of you about the work in California and also what you're working on and other workforce development policies that you might be monitoring or working on. All right, so let's dig into the Digital Equity Act. So as some of you may know, there was a federal legislation, so $2.75 billion nationwide that's being distributed over 5 years, and it's being administered by the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so this is going to provide funding for states, localities, and nonprofits, and others who provide the wide range of digital inclusion services. This could be anything from helping broadband access, digital devices, digital skills, among the myriad of other things. We specifically wanted to highlight that English learners, rural residents, and people of color are among the covered populations. that states must specifically address under this law. And Amanda's going to talk a little bit more about who those covered populations are.
Thanks so much, Karina. Karina is one of two staff of ours based in California. We have another colleague who is on the West Coast, but she's actually in Oregon. So we are delighted to be with all of you today. And I want to give a special shout out to Dr. Martinez and to CVIIC for having brought everyone together here. I have been privileged in the last 5 days to be part of 3 separate conversations in which people were feeling great urgency about making sure that nonprofit community-based organizations and immigrant advocates got information about this new federal funding. I was in New Orleans last week with the National Governors Association. I spoke with federal officials at the U.S. Department of Commerce who are overseeing this funding. And just this afternoon, I was on a call with the Aspen Latino Digital Success Task Force. And in all cases, there was great urgency around making sure that this information is in the hands of people who can make use of it. So I hope that you'll find today's conversation useful. You'll get slides and the recording after today, so you'll be able to share it with colleagues who might not have been able to join. And you'll also have lots of time to ask questions, both at the end of the webinar today, but you'll also have Karina's contact info and mine so that you can follow up with us if you have questions following, sort of once you've had a chance to digest. Okay, so this is part of the big infrastructure law that Congress passed back in November. And oops, if we can go forward, yeah, thanks. And to the next slide, great. So the infrastructure bill is an 1,100-page piece of legislation, but the Digital Equity Act is about 4 pages. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed at the thought of reading a full piece of legislation, you can just click on that earlier link in the previous slide where it says full legislative text and just do a find for Digital Equity Act and you'll get to the little 4-page section. Right now, states, including California, are scrambling to put together their applications to the Federal Commerce Department to get the very first small state-level digital equity planning grant. The state has to apply by July 12th to be exact. They'll get that grant from the feds by the end of September, and there'll be a 12-month digital equity planning process. Then starting next year, there's 2 much larger pots of money. There's formula funding that will automatically go to every state. And there's competitive grant funding that states and nonprofits and others can compete for. We're going to talk through each of these funding streams so you know what they are and how you can get engaged in them. But I wanted you to have this slide as just kind of the big picture overview. Next slide. Okay. So how can we start now to prepare, given that this money is coming down the pike? And some of you have heard me say this before, but more than 1 in 10 Americans is a Californian. So California has a huge impact on, on this, any federal funding program, and will certainly get a huge chunk of the money available, because the funding formula that sends the money to states is based in part on the size of a state's population. So there will be quite a lot of money coming to California. Next slide. So the first thing to do is to make sure that you're in contact with the state agency that will be overseeing your digital equity plan. Now, it's likely in California that that will be the California Department of Technology. You'll know that for sure in a few weeks when it's publicly announced. And once that gets publicly announced, you'll want to make sure that you're in contact with those state officials to make sure that immigrants and English learners can have their voices heard during the planning process. The law says that every state has to make their draft digital equity plan available for a 30-day public comment period. But the truth is, you want to be at the table before that. You want to be at the table to shape the plan. And the reason you want to be at the table to shape the plan is because the plan is going to be the roadmap for how that much bigger pot of money is spent next year. So we're not just working on a plan for the sake of a plan. We're working on a plan that's going to shape how your state is going to spend tens of millions of dollars in additional funding over the next 5 years. Next slide. Okay, so there's some key terms in the Digital Equity Act that are really powerful, and I want to make sure that we go over those in depth. And the first one is covered populations. Next slide. So there are a lot of covered populations in the Act, and I've got the list on the next slide here, that overlap with immigrants and refugees, right? You can probably see many of the people and communities that you serve reflected in this list. People with income below 150% of poverty, senior citizens, folks who have limited English proficiency, folks who are, the law uses this very outdated 1980s terminology, members of a racial or ethnic minority group. And then I think importantly for those of you in the Central Valley, individuals who primarily reside in a rural area. These covered populations mean that states have to talk in their digital equity plans about how they are going to serve each of these groups of people, how they're going to measure whether they are effectively serving each of these groups of people, and how they're going to make sure that each of these groups of people are actually making progress towards greater digital equity. And again, going back to what Karina talked about, we talk about the 3 legs of the digital inclusion stool. Do people have broadband internet access? Do they have an up-to-date digital device to use? And do they have the digital skills to be able to use these effectively? I know some of you who are listening here today are already doing this work. I saw in the chat that we have Building Skills Partnership with us. They've been working with immigrant janitors to help them build digital skills. I know many others are also already working on these issues. So Congress didn't invent this new legislation as if no one had been doing the work on the ground. Congress recognizes that many of you have been doing this work on the ground. The goal is to make sure that your state is really being thoughtful and intentional about making sure that work is reaching all of the communities who most need digital access and inclusion. Next slide. So one of the other terms I wanted to highlight is the kinds of organizations that will be eligible entities for grants. Next slide. So again, there's 2 big pots of money coming next year. There's the formula funding that will go to your state agency, and then your state agency will re-grant that down to the local level. And then there's the federal grant application process, where you can apply directly to the federal government. So we don't know yet exactly what the process will be for getting that formula funding. There could be a request for proposals, there could be some other process. And the reason we don't know that yet is because California doesn't know that yet, right? They haven't decided and they haven't told the federal government yet what their process will be. But we do know that there will be a process and that the roadmap that the state develops in its digital equity plan will be a key map for how that funding is distributed. So again, this is why it's so important to be at the planning table. Competitive grants. I know because I used to work for a small community-based nonprofit myself, and we used to joke that policy was what we did in the 50th through the 60th hours of our week. And it wasn't really a joke, because when you work in direct service, there's always more work to be done, right? So I know that many of you may not have a grant writer on staff or may not have the capacity to apply directly to the federal government for a big grant, but you might be able to collaborate with a set of partners and have one of those agencies be the one applying directly to the federal government. So this is a great time to start thinking about who would you want to collaborate with, who might have the capacity to take the lead on drafting a federal proposal, and getting those relationships in place now so that next year when the federal government publishes the notice of funding opportunity, that you're ready to hit the ground running and submit a proposal. Next slide. Okay, so the third category to be familiar with is sort of eligible entities, right? So who is eligible to receive one of these federal competitive grants? And I've got a non-exhaustive list here, but basically if you're a nonprofit, or if you're a community anchor institution, which is defined in the law and includes things like community colleges, you will be eligible to apply for a grant. you can also be a partnership between a number of different entities, right? So if you're running an adult education program and you're partnering with a state agency or with a workforce development program, you have lots and lots of possible on-ramps here. Next slide. So if you were so lucky as to get this funding, what kind of services can you provide? In other words, what can this cover? Next slide. So again, the Digital Equity Act defines key terms. And here I've put on the slide the definitions for digital inclusion and digital literacy. Next slide. These are really just so you have something to go back later and refer to. If you get one of the federal competitive grants, there's a long list of activities that you can engage in, and you have to pick at least one of them that you're going to do. And what I've highlighted here in green are training programs, because I know many of you are running workforce development or adult education programs, and you might find a natural home in one of these categories. So again, you've got a year to prepare for what you might want to apply for the federal funding. This is why it's a great time now to start thinking about this and to make sure that your state digital equity plan is really outlining a vision that your organization and your work can fit underneath, right? The folks who drafted this law were really very cognizant about immigrant and refugee issues writ large. They are not experts on farm workers, right? None of the three leading senators who sponsored this legislation are big farm worker experts. So for those of you who do work with farm workers, this is an opportunity for you to think about, okay, how do we make sure that the rural populations piece or some of the other pieces in this law really speak to the communities that I serve? Next slide. Okay. So we've just thrown a whole lot of information at you, and we have an opportunity now for some conversation and reflection. So I'm going to turn things back over to Karina, and she's going to lead us through a conversation to talk a little bit about what you're thinking and hearing as you hear all this, what your questions are. At the end of today's presentation, Karina will show you a couple of other resources slides that we have in this slide deck. We're not going to go through those slides in great depth right now. We just want you to know that you have them to refer to in the future to dig deeper. So let me turn it back over to you, Karina.
Thanks, Amanda. So yes, we want to hear from you. Like Amanda said, there was a lot of information. So we want to know what you're wondering about, what questions you have for us. You can either put them in the Q&A box. I believe you can also go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask the question. But we also want you all to start thinking and let us know what you're thinking about what are the implications for the Central Valley. If you're not from the Central Valley, what are the implications for the communities that you're serving?
And also general questions if people want further clarification on any of the points that were made in the presentation. By all means, if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and unmute yourself. We'll recognize you, but also ask the question via the Q&A or chat box.
So we'll give folks a few seconds. I know that was a lot of information. But questions about the process, questions about who you should be reaching out here in California, how you can get involved in the planning process, let us know. And also how this can impact your work that you're currently doing now. Just like Amanda said before, we know that a lot of you are already doing this work. So what does, okay, I see one question. From Matias Bernal. Any idea when the stakeholder meetings in California will start?
So the short answer is no, we don't know for sure. I would reach out to Scott Adams and his team at the California Department of Technology, bearing in mind that right now they are really hurrying to get their federal application in by July 12th. So it might take a few weeks for them to get back to you. But I think they'll be best positioned to let folks know what the kind of stakeholder engagement will look like. Will it be listening sessions? Will it be a survey? Will there be other opportunities to engage? So definitely I would do that. The other date to keep in mind is the federal government has promised that by September 29th, all of the state digital equity planning grants, the little tiny bit of money that states get to get going on their planning process, that will all have been distributed. So September is the absolute latest that you should start to hear useful things about how to engage in your digital equity planning process. You'll probably hear it before September, but you'll certainly hear it by September.
Thank you. We have a question by Edgar. Go ahead, Edgar, unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Edgar Cease of the California Immigrant Policy Center. I was wondering if you can go back to that slide just for a moment about the eligible activities that can be used under the Digital Equity Act.
Oh, I think that was actually it. Sorry, Karina, can you go forward again? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. With regards to number 3, the one specifically about training programs, so I guess my question is a bit of a two-parter. I was wondering if these programs will align somehow with things that are happening right now with the high road training partnerships, and if there may be something there to connect with on. And also the second part is, since these seem to be workforce activities specifically, do we know if they're going to be they're going to fall under the requirements that workforce activities fall under with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act?
So there is no requirement that people who go through Digital Equity Act training programs have, for example, work authorization, right? So they're not the same as the requirements under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. If you go through training under WIOA, in most cases, as Edgar knows better than anybody because he wrote a whole report on this, you have to have work authorization. That is not true in this law. And we at National Skills Coalition have submitted public comments to ask the federal government to be very explicit about announcing that. They have not yet done that, but I'm hoping that they will do that in a future FAQ that they release, just to reassure people that you can provide this training regardless of immigration status. The other thing to be aware of is they're very clear that training programs could not necessarily be workforce related, right? Some people might be doing digital literacy classes for stay-at-home parents of young children who want to improve their digital skills so that they can follow along with their child's K-12 education later on, or senior citizens who are maybe out of the workforce and not looking to get back into the workforce. So workers are definitely covered under this law, but workers are not the only group covered under this law. And training can definitely include workforce training, but you can also do training that is not directly related to the workforce. And I'm happy to repeat any of that because I know that's just a ton of very dense information. Edgar, does that answer your question? Do you have additional follow-up on that?
No, that's totally perfect. Thank you. And I appreciate that other piece you brought up also about how the training component is very multitudinous and doesn't necessarily pertain to just workforce. That's a very helpful clarification. Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you,
Who else? Go ahead.
Eleazar, you also raised your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sorry, it was an accident. Sorry.
So we have 2 other questions that came in through the Q&A box. The first is around if we can elaborate on what type of skills are considered digital skills, and how is progress measured? Is it done through timed assessments or based on understanding? I believe that we had a slide on that.
Okay, Yeah, I don't know that we have a detailed slide on that in this PowerPoint, but I think we do have a slide on the other question, which is digital equity versus digital inclusion, which I think you have brought up here. We'll get to that in a minute. So on this question of digital skills, so right now, there are a small number of assessments that exist for digital skills. So just to kind of give everybody some background information, if you're testing somebody's English skills, or if you're testing to see if somebody needs to get their high school diploma or equivalent, there are usually several different standardized tests that you could use to assess their skills. For digital skills, right now, there are still very few tests, and most of the tests that are out there are testing on a particular product, right? So Microsoft Office is going to test you on Microsoft products, and the Cisco networking certification is going to, certify you as a Cisco networking person, right? There is a broader assessment called the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. North Star was developed by a nonprofit in Minnesota. It's in English only right now, but they are working to make it multilingual. And North Star, you can test it for free on their website. Because they're a nonprofit, they try to make it as accessible as possible for people, so it's not a crazy expensive test to have to use. It tests for foundational digital skills. Really basic things like, are you comfortable sending an email? Are you comfortable navigating basic menus on kinds of Word or Excel, that kind of a thing. There are other assessments out there that are just kind of a self-report checklist. So it asks you things like, are you comfortable downloading a new app onto your mobile phone? Are you comfortable taking a photo and texting it to someone? And those kinds of self-assessments can be really helpful. But what the federal government has said is, we don't have a lot of tests right now. We don't have a lot of ways to measure digital skills. So we want states to tell us how they're going to be measuring digital skills, and more importantly, how they're going to be making sure that all these covered populations have equitable access to opportunities to build their skills. So there's a lot that we don't know right now. And there's a lot of people scrambling to try to figure out, well, what do we count as a digital skill? How do we measure it? What's a fair way of measuring it? What if we're only measuring things in English? Won't we miss people who have really good skills in other languages? If all we're really just testing is in English, then we're really giving them an English test more than a digital skills test. And we can't pretend that it's a digital skills test if what we're really just testing is their English reading comprehension, right? So these are the kinds of problems that people are wrestling with right now. And there's a couple of big federal research projects funded by the Department of Education that is actually trying to create what are going to be the new tests that people can use, what is genuinely meaningful to people and not going to waste their time and energy. If you want to talk more about that, you'll have my contact information. You can go offline and shoot me an email. I don't want to go in more depth in this conversation because this has already been a really long answer, but I wanted folks to have enough background to understand that testing should work for our communities, not as a tool to keep our communities out, right? And so it's really important for us to have a voice at the table from the very beginning so that the decisions that California makes about testing don't shut out the very people that we're actually trying to serve. Right? That is super, super important. Karina, do you want to talk a little bit about the digital inclusion definition here that's in the law, and then we can go on from there?
Yeah, and thank you for that question of digital equity and digital inclusion. So here we have, and again, we'll be sending this, so you'll have this for your records, but the definitions of digital inclusion and digital literacy, we know that that can be a little bit confusing for folks, but just as it's in the law, this is what we put. So it means that the activities that are necessary to ensure that all individuals in the US have access to the use of affordable information and communication technologies, and it kind of goes into more detail, which is like reliable fixed and wireless broadband, as we mentioned before, internet-enabled devices, such as like laptops and others that meet the needs for the users, and also that these have applications to online content. And so for all of these to encourage the folks to be self-sufficient, be able to be active in participation and collaboration. So be able for folks to connect with others. And it includes something very important. So obtaining access to digital literacy training, which I'll briefly cover, and the provision of quality technical support. So so having folks access to these devices, being able to access broadband, access digital literacy training, and also what Amanda was saying about digital skills training is having the basic awareness of online privacy and cybersecurity. It's not just having the devices, but having awareness around it. And going into the definition of digital literacy, it just means that the skills associated with using these technologies, that the users have the skills associated to using these, and that they evaluate, organize, create, and communicate information. So these are the definitions in the law. I'm happy to go into more detail. I know that creates some confusion for folks.
Thanks so much, Karina. And then I just dropped into the chat the one other definition that I didn't put on the slide because I felt like the slide already had so many words on it. But the law actually also defines the term digital equity, which, as you can see, is pretty short. So that definition is also codified for the first time in federal law.
Edgar, I saw that you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi. Is double dipping okay?
Yeah, you can definitely ask your second question, and then we'll get to the other questions in the Q&A after that. Yep.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I was looking in the definition about digital equity, and something that just quickly came up is going back to that piece about metrics. Do we have a way of ensuring that this isn't just a way to sort of like funnel people into these winnow and very specific outcomes like employment or jobs, but is there a way to make the definition more holistic? Like, for example, digital equity, digital literacy as a means of somebody who's trying to get like a citizenship, or someone who just wants to be able to apply for a driver's license or something, or things like of that nature. Do we know if digital equity is being thought of in that way by the authors of this specific program?
So the short answer is some of the definitions that the law uses come from an older piece of legislation called I think it was the Museum and Library Services Act, if I remember correctly. So it sort of comes from public libraries. The short answer is I think the Department of Commerce is open to people talking about a broad, inclusive vision of all the kinds of activities that could fall under the umbrella of digital equity. And I know that the advocates who helped draft this legislation were definitely envisioning a big picture and not just any one kind of digital literacy skill. This is a good opportunity, though, because there's two opportunities for advocacy. One is, again, making sure that your state's digital equity plan is really explicit about all the different things that can be included under the big digital equity umbrella. And the second is there will be some opportunities to submit comments to the federal government. Periodically, they release what's called an RFI or an RFC, a request for information or a request for comment. If you're interested in contributing to those federal requests for comment, definitely follow up with Karina or me after today and let us know, and we'll put you on the mailing list so that you can find out when that is going to happen. I'm going to put the link to the North Star in the chat, and then Karina, if you can pull up the covered population slide, I think we can use that to answer Doreena's question from the chat, or from the Q&A box rather, sorry. So Dorina's question was whether this is focused on rural communities. The answer is no, it's not just rural communities. There's a long list of who is covered under this law, and rural communities are one of those. So whatever part of the state you live in, I promise you, there is a significant number of people who are specifically called out as a covered population under this law. Most of the state of California is included in one or more of these categories.
And we have another question from Anna Castro relating specifically to helping provide services for immigrants. She was giving an example about their immigration legal services and if it's included to like help clients access the remote immigration services.
So I am not a lawyer, and I can't remember whether there are rules in the Federal Legal Services Act that would affect that. So the short answer is I don't know. And I would strongly encourage you to talk to either your American Immigration Lawyers Association, your AILA chapter, ask them that question, or your other BIA accredited reps to see if you could go together to the feds to get that clarification, because legal services are distinct from lots of other things under federal law, right? You could be helping people sign up for public housing or helping people get early childhood education or all these other things, and it's very easy and clearly understood under federal law, but there are special and different rules about legal services. And so I don't want to give you wrong information. And I would strongly encourage you to go to either a nonprofit association or a state or the AILA chapter and ask them to bring that question to the feds, because that's not the kind of question that you would want to kind of cross your fingers and hope for, right? You want to get a very clear answer from the federal government about that. And it's not in the text of the legislation, I can tell you that. I'm not even sure they contemplated that when they were drafting this legislation. So I think you're going to have to ask that question, and you're going to get a better chance of getting a good answer if you get AILA or a state association or some other nonprofit group that represents legal services folks to clarify that question for the feds. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful.
We have another pretty specific question around IT programs and certifications and what would be covered under the information technology capacity.
That is the $1 million question. We don't know yet. So there's the goal of the federal law is to kind of be pretty big picture and saying, hey, there's lots of different ways you can help people build skills. Inevitably, there's going to be a lot of for-profit vendors and companies that go running after this money and say, oh, good, maybe we can apply for this money to get us to get people to pay to take our certification. The intent of this law is to close digital equity gaps for that group of covered populations that you just saw Karina list on the slide earlier. So whatever certification or IT program somebody might want to participate in, a question would be, is that program genuinely likely to help them build an in-demand skill that is connected to something that an employer really wants them to hire? Or is that program going to help them build a skill that will close an equity gap as your state has identified those gaps? This is back when I was talking about all those standardized tests and how a lot is going to rest on how a state defines things. This goes back to that question, right? Because on the one hand, you want to cast a broad net because you don't want to assume that any one training program or any one type of digital skill is going to be all anyone needs. But on the other hand, if you cast a really broad net, you might bring in some bad actors or some other folks who might try to take advantage of immigrants or other individuals rather, under the law. So it's kind of a tricky balancing act. If there's a program that you are already thinking of that you think is really good or really bad, that is a good thing to talk to your state leaders about sooner rather than later, so that the rules that they're writing at the state level will actually reflect what you want to see them reflect as far as what you think is a good resource for people, as opposed to something that's not a good resource for people. I did drop the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment tool into the chat if folks are interested. That's the one that is created by the nonprofit in Minnesota. Do folks have other questions or observations? We're also happy to just take your comments. So if there's stuff that's exciting about this to you or stuff that makes you worried about the communities that you serve, we'd love to hear those comments too, even if there's not questions associated with them.
I have a question, Amanda, and it's not for you or Karina, but for the colleagues who are on the call, the webinar. Of those who have joined us for this webinar, have any of your organizations developed a program like this one, dealing with digital training? If so, how has it worked for you? And how will you try to take advantage of this funding opportunity from the federal government? And maybe there are some already who have established something along these lines, but we'd love to hear from anybody who has set up any type of digital training opportunity. And if you have, if you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, tell us a little bit about it.
I don't want
Hi
to.
everyone, Eleazar here from CVIIC.
Yeah.
I do have a question. So this is very available information for the community. In the Central Valley, we have rural communities. So how are we going to disseminate this information to somebody that doesn't speak English, or somebody maybe that speaks only, not in Spanish or English, but an indigenous language?
So I think there's two questions here, right? One is, how do you let people who speak Spanish or indigenous languages know about these services? And the other is, how can you provide services to them in this language? And both of those questions are important. On the question of how do you reach those communities, I do think that this is a moment for advocacy and for holding your state officials' feet to the fire. They will try, and I don't mean anything personal by this, but in general, states will try to get away with what they can get away with. Okay, we held a stakeholder meeting in these different communities. Push them to have interpretation available at meetings. Push them with statistics about how many people in that community speak languages other than English at home. Email them in advance and ask if there's going to be an interpreter available at any public meeting. So that's the first thing to do, right? Is just push to make sure that the state is really doing all that it should do to make sure they're hearing feedback in languages other than English. But on the other question, I do want to flag, the two folks that I know of that are working on digital skills for multilingual communities are quite distinct. One is the nonprofit Literacy Minnesota that I mentioned before. They are working on trying to translate their North Star assessment into other languages. The other is actually the employer, Tyson Foods. Now, we all know that there are a lot of challenges with food processing plant jobs. They can be really ugly, dangerous, difficult jobs. But Tyson employs about 120,000 workers, 60% of whom are immigrants and refugees. And their director of digital literacy is the former adult education director for the state of Texas. And he is really fiercely committed to developing digital literacy materials in languages other than English. So he has Burmese refugees working for him. He's developing materials in Quran and other things. If he is somebody that will be interesting or useful for any of you to be connected with, I'm happy to make that connection. Because right now, the world of digital skills curriculum and materials is really depressingly monolingual. It is very English focused. And there's no reason for that to be the case, right? We already know the communities we serve are using WhatsApp, they're using other technologies on their phones in other languages. there's no reason that all digital skills instruction has to be in English. People should have the opportunity to build both English and digital skills at the same time if they want to, but they should absolutely also have the opportunity to be educated in the language that they are most comfortable in. So like I said, there's only a handful of folks that I know that are doing direct work on this issue right now, and I'm happy to connect you if you email me offline. I think we may have some other comments in the chat. I'm going to take a moment to look at this. I know we also have Building Skills Partnership on the call, and I think BSP, I don't know if the staffer who's on the call today is the one who has worked on the digital literacy program there. So I don't want to put you on the spot if you're not ready, but if you are and you want to unmute yourself, I know folks would be interested in hearing about what BSP has done.
And we also got some comments from other colleagues. Hugo Morales from Radio Bilingue has been involved in these sorts of issues over a number of years. So Hugo, if you'd like to talk, please do so. We also have comments from Debbie Arthur, from Jose Martinez, and also from Evelyn Espinosa, who also are sharing what they have done so far. So any of you would like to speak, by all means, raise your hand. Let me see. Hugo, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, we've been working on this now for 20 years, Radio Bilingue, but we are Radio Bilingue, right? We're radio. And so what we have done is promoted training and how would I say? Yeah, connected families, low income, including indigenous families, to partners that are actually connecting people. We've done that with a partner, United Way of California, over the years, and then more recently also with a branch of Fresno State. So, and then in terms of actual training, that is something that is, from what I know, is really how would I say? Let's just say there hasn't been that much activity on that, though. Fresno Unified said they have contracted with some vendors. Frankly, I don't know who they are for some of that. But I don't know the vendors. But the experience of CBOs that Redwing has had has been, again, over the past 20 years, have been some nonprofits out of the Bay Area, mostly around San Francisco, Oakland, and the South Bay. And they've been the ones, including Monterey County, where these nonprofits have worked to, capacitar, to build the competence of digital literacy. I don't remember any one of those training folks other than in English and Spanish, though. I don't remember any one of them putting themselves out as serving indigenous and training indigenous peoples.
I'm going to ask Karina to just quickly flash up on screen the last few slides here. We're not going to go through them in depth, but I want you to see that they are here for your reference. We have a link to our Principles for Digital Equity. There's a great example of how North Carolina has done local level digital equity plans, which are publicly available. So if you want to do some local planning in your community without even waiting for the state, there's some great resources there. And then Hawaii did a great digital readiness survey, a telephone and online survey of state residents to make sure that they got people who weren't online. So that's written up in a blog post that we did. And then we have some other publications that are on the last slide. So you'll have all these slides when Dr. Martinez sends them out with the recording after today. But I just wanted to walk them through, and then you have our contact details on the very last slide. I do see one last question, a question from Anna at CVIIC. We have a virtual program about entrepreneurship for Spanish speakers who want to start a business. We've noticed they struggle with technology and have low digital literacy. Most use a cell phone to manage their business. How do you think we could support them to improve their digital literacy with this limitation? So there's a community of folks who are working on exactly this question. How do we support very small entrepreneurs using mostly mobile technology, smartphones, sometimes tablet computers, but not a laptop or a desktop. I would ask actually that you drop me an email, and I'd be happy to connect you with some of the other folks who are working on this issue, because it's definitely a topic that I think a lot of folks are wrestling with and trying to figure out. And I know they would love to talk to other peers in the field who are also trying to figure this out. And it looks like you've dropped your email into the chat. So thank you so much for doing that. Karina, let me turn things back over to you to see if you have anything else to add. And then I guess Dr. Martinez will close us out.
No, just want to say thank you for everyone. It was great to see all the examples from folks. I was taking notes, but ultimately there were too many. Sorry, we couldn't mention all of them, but thank you for sharing. And again, like Amanda said, please reach out to us for your various questions. And for me, I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing in California, and kind of get your thoughts on what other things we can help you out, or what policies you're working on. And I'll put our emails in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Jesus.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Karina. Before we end, I also want to encourage everyone to contact Silvia Romo from Build the Skills Partnership, who they have run, as she indicates, a digital literacy program for janitors that they work with. And BSP is a really great organization. So I don't know, Silvia, if you would like to briefly share with us, unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do, and then people can follow up with you afterwards via email.
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, just briefly. Yeah, we have done digital literacy both at the workplace, so vocationally focused digital skills for janitors, because even in that line of work, it's increasingly becoming digitized, where they're being given cell phones to complete work orders and the like. And also we provide classes in the union halls that are open and free to community members. And they're conducted in Spanish. And it's been a long road. So I certainly want to lend our longer experience to anybody, so you don't have to go through the same process of trial and error. Just to say that, it is a challenge, and there's no roadmap that's already been created, especially with the language barriers on top of literacy challenges. There's no off-the-shelf product that will serve these communities and these populations well. So we've had to sort of invent it where it's not already invented. And just to share one, it truly has been a path of trial and error. And there's a lot of creativity and excitement in that. And our newest pilot project is to actually train 4 janitors themselves to become what we're calling digital navigators. And that's to address the need. Amanda referenced the three legs of the stool, right? There's the device, the training, and the internet connection. But we found that there's actually a 4th leg, which I guess would make it a chair at that point, which is sustained IT support that's linguistically and culturally appropriate. So we've trained these 4 digital navigators to, and it's paid training. And then we're going to pay them to provide that sustained IT support for janitors who we've gifted laptops to. So they'll be able to call a number and get someone, a true peer of theirs to walk them through any number of, IT issues, big or small. So we're really excited about that. We're going to be rolling that out in the next couple of weeks. But I left my email address in the chat, and please feel free to reach out to me. We're very excited about what we're doing, and we'd love to collaborate.
Silvia, thank you very much for sharing those insights and experience. I think we all will benefit greatly from your information. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. I will be emailing in a few minutes the presentation to everyone who registered for the event. And as you can see in the PowerPoint presentation, Karina and Amanda also share their email. So please feel free to contact them, as they have so graciously invited us to do. Thank you, everyone. We will also record it, and we'll upload it to the civic.org website when we have a little bit of a chance, but we will email you the presentation in a few minutes. Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much, Karina. You have started us on the path to a greater awareness about this important issue. And we hope that we can continue to count on your support and information down the line, because this process is just starting. And as we learned with the census back in 2018, it takes a long time for our organizations and our region to be able to develop the capacity to then do the work that's going to be needed and benefit our communities, whichever ones we serve. Thank you very much.